My parents always covered for my brother and punished me for his mistakes. They tried to humiliate me at a wedding, but karma publicly got them back. I'm telling this as if it's all happening right now because if I stop and analyze it, it becomes too difficult. It's easier to talk like I breathe, briefly, in fragments, like memories emerging. Because childhood isn't a linear story. It's fragments, smells, intonations, other people's words that are forever stuck in my head. There were always two different childhoods in our house. One was my older brother, Jaeger. The other was mine. Jaeger was expected. He was planned. He was called our meaning. I wasn't called anything. I simply was. Like an extra object in the room that no one removes, but also doesn't notice as long as it doesn't get in the way. The difference was noticeable from a very early age. When Jaeger didn't like something, everyone adjusted to him. When I didn't like it, they explained to me why I was wrong. If he cried, they pitied him. If I cried, they told me I was manipulating. I learned a simple rule early on. Jaeger's emotions are important. Mine are annoying. As soon as Jaeger said, she did it, it was over. Even if he didn't specify what exactly. That was enough for my parents. They didn't believe the facts, but his tone. Confident. Accusatory. Adult. They never questioned me. I was punished right away. Sometimes it was a belt. Sometimes it was the corner. Sometimes it was food deprivation. Sometimes it was silence. The worst form of punishment is when they simply stop talking to you, as if you didn't exist. I remember once he accused me of scratching his tablet. I was 10. I hadn't even held it in my hands. I tried to explain, but Dad said, "Stop lying." Mom added, "You should be ashamed of yourself." The tablet was later found under the couch. He'd been scratched for a long time. No one apologized. No one even remembered that I'd been punished. If Igor did something bad, the blame was still shifted to me. Because I'd pushed him. Because I'd provoked him. Because I'd messed around in the wrong place. Even if I'd kept quiet. Even if I wasn't there. Even if he'd admitted it himself. My parents said he was impulsive, and I should be smarter, calmer, more patient. As if patience were the responsibility of a younger child. Family outings were always tailored to him. Movies were what he wanted. Food was his favorite. Music in the car was his playlist. Even on my birthdays, something would often happen that made him the center of attention. He'd ruin the mood, throw a tantrum, and the celebration would instantly turn into an attempt to calm him down. They explained to me that I had to be understanding. Always. When I got older, the situation became dangerous. He started hitting me. At first, it was supposedly an accident. Then, as a joke. Then, without explanation. I learned to back away quickly. To close doors. To walk quietly. I stopped wearing revealing clothes because the bruises needed to be hidden. When Mom noticed them, she said I was being overly dramatic. Dad said I was driving him crazy with my temper. I first realized something was wrong with Igor when I overheard his classmates talking at school. I was just passing by. They were talking about him with disgust. About how he humiliated people. How he said cruel things. How he crossed boundaries. I stood behind my locker and felt a strange relief. So I wasn't crazy. So the problem wasn't me. But with that came fear. If everyone knew, why didn't my parents? I had friends. Not many. But they were real. And this became a new reason for Igor to hate me. He started telling my parents that they were a bad influence on me. That I was lying. That I had become impudent. My parents believed him. Always. They said he was older and understood people better. And I should listen. My cousins became my only refuge. It was different at their house. There they didn't yell. There they asked. There they listened. One day, they invited me to hang out, but my parents forbade it. I couldn't take it anymore. I said, I can't be friends because Jaeger has no friends. I said it without anger, as a matter of fact. But that phrase exploded. It spread throughout the family. Questions began to fly. My parents denied everything. Then they got angry. Then they punished me for lying. But something still broke. Their perfect picture cracked. Jaeger was transferred to another school. An expensive one. A prestigious one. For his sake. He never forgave me. After Jaeger was transferred to another school, nothing got any easier. My parents pretended they'd made a difficult, mature decision. That they'd saved the situation. In reality, they simply moved the problem without changing the essence. They didn't correct Jaeger. They protected him. And I remained the same lightning rod, the one that channeled all his failures and bad moods. Now he has new friends. Or, more accurately, the people who tolerated him long enough to spend time together. He started bringing them home. I knew right away it would end badly. They acted like they owned the apartment. They'd come in without knocking. They'd open my refrigerator. They'd laugh at me as if I were part of the decor, not a living person. They didn't do it all at once, but gradually. First jokes, then taunts, then petty mischief. They'd hide my notebooks, change my computer passwords. Once, they put salt in my tea. When I coughed and spat it into the sink, they laughed so loudly you could hear it in the other room. Mom peeked out and said we were making too much noise, then added, "Boys are just fooling around." I wanted to ask then who I was in that sentence. A toy? A background noise? A distraction? I stopped complaining. Complaining didn't change anything except that things got worse. Every time I tried to tell my parents, they either didn't believe me or said I was exaggerating. Sometimes they added that it was my own fault for overreacting. I began to learn to be inconspicuous, walk more quietly, lock myself in my room, do my homework late at night to avoid running into them. I was 16 when I had my first boyfriend. His name was Maxim. He was calm, polite, the kind of person you could easily be around. I didn't want to introduce him to my parents. I felt it was a bad idea, but my parents insisted. They said they had to make sure I wasn't getting involved with someone unknown. I agreed because I still believed that if I did everything right, maybe this time everything would work out. It didn't. 20 minutes later, Maxim found me on the landing. He was pale, his eyes darting around. He said Jaeger cornered him in the kitchen. He said nasty things about me. He implied he didn't need me. He said he got too close. He said he touched his arm. Maxim said he felt uncomfortable and scared. He left almost immediately, without saying goodbye. I knew what would happen next. And I still hoped that at least once my parents would doubt me. They didn't. Jaeger said it was Maxim who had been bothering him, that he had refused out of respect for me, that he felt disgusted and humiliated. Mom cried, holding Jaeger close. Dad yelled at me. He asked how I could bring such a man into the house. I tried to explain. They didn't listen. I was forbidden to see Maxim. My phone was checked. My messages were read. I was deprived of any personal space. It happened again. Almost verbatim. Another guy. Same story. I finally told him it wasn't a coincidence anymore. That Jaeger was doing it on purpose. Mom looked at me as if I'd said something monstrous. Dad said I had trouble choosing men. That I attracted those kinds. And that they were afraid for Jaeger. I gave in. I stopped trying to build normal relationships. There were kisses. There were secret meetings. But I always said, going home is not an option. Family is taboo. Most people understood. Some left. It was painful, but familiar. Meanwhile, Jaeger was living his life to the fullest. He brought his boyfriend. His parents were delighted. They cooked his favorite dishes, gave him gifts, took photos together. They asked me why I couldn't find someone equally decent. When this guy disappeared, the story changed again. They pitted Jaeger. They said he was being used. I later learned from friends that he was trying to flirt with this guy's friend. But, of course, no one spoke about this out loud. Double standards were everywhere. Jaeger had money, freedom, and late homecomings. I had restrictions, reports, and suspicions. When I pointed this out, they told me he was older. When I became the same age, the arguments changed. Now I was unreliable, impulsive, too emotional. When Jaeger graduated from high school and entered a mediocre university, my parents threw a party. With a photographer. With a cake. With speeches about pride. They promised to pay for everything. The rent. My tuition. Any expenses. I just sat there and said nothing. A year later, my mother called me in for a talk. A serious one. She said there was no money for my education. That I needed to go to work. If I wanted to live at home, I'd have to pay for everything myself. She said it was for my own good. That Jaeger was investing in the future, while I was more practical. I said, okay. Because by that moment, I was already preparing to run away. By the time of that conversation with my mother, I no longer felt anger or surprise. There was only a strange calm, like before a long-anticipated storm. I knew it would happen. I was just waiting for it to finally be said out loud. For them to say it outright. We can't count on you. They didn't know that I'd been preparing for this conversation for years. While Jaeger was partying, changing plans, abandoning things and starting again, I was studying. At night. In silence. taking advantage of every opportunity to get away from home. The school psychologist, Irina Valeryevna, was the first adult who didn't see me through Jaeger's lens. She asked me what I wanted. That question knocked me off my feet. I'd never been asked that question before. She helped me with the documents, the applications, the grants. Everything was done in secret. I didn't tell my parents anything. I knew that if they found out ahead of time, they would either try to stop me or convince me I wouldn't succeed. And I couldn't afford to doubt. Doubt is a luxury when your freedom depends on your decision. When the acceptance letter arrived, I reread it 10 times. A full grant. A state university in another city. Not ideal, but real. A real chance. I sat on my bed and cried into my pillow, so no one could hear. These weren't tears of joy. These were tears of relief. As if I had finally surfaced after being underwater for so long. I told my parents at the last minute, and immediately, publicly. I posted it, tagged them, thanked them for their support. It wasn't gloating. It was protective. They couldn't stop me from leaving without explaining it to the whole family. At first, they were proud. Then they began to doubt. Then they'd say I couldn't handle it. That Jaeger was smarter. That it would be hard for me. I stood my ground. They backed down. Reluctantly. But they backed down. The move was my salvation. For the first time, I lived without constant tension. Without expecting a blow. Without having to justify my very existence. I still apologized too often. I still flinched at sudden noises. But I breathed. And that was the main thing. Jaeger, by the way, didn't last long at university. He dropped out after a year. He came home. He didn't pay for anything. His parents found him a job through friends and called it a great achievement. I listened to this on the phone and felt emptiness. Not pain anymore. Just emptiness. I met Daniil in my 3rd year. We were sitting next to each other in economics. The teacher was telling me something incredibly boring, and at one point, Daniil leaned over and quietly said that it seemed like we were paying for the opportunity to listen to poor quality stand-up. I burst out laughing. I couldn't help it. And then something clicked. He was different. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't push. He noticed the little things. When I apologized for someone bumping into me in the hallway, he'd stop and say it wasn't my fault. At first, it was irritating. Then it was frightening. Then it became something warm. I didn't tell him about my family right away. At first, in bits and pieces. In fragments. As if I was testing to see if he would run away. He didn't. He listened. Sometimes he was angrier than me. Sometimes he was just silent, squeezing my hand. He said, "This isn't normal. Not everyone does this. Not, they want the best for you. Just, this isn't normal." When he proposed, I cried. Not from happiness. From fear. Because I knew marriage meant coming into contact with them again. With my parents. With Jaeger. I wanted to run away to the registry office, sign the marriage certificate quietly, and disappear. But Daniil offered a compromise. A small wedding. No frills. But in my hometown. Because his family was scattered across the country, and mine was all there. I agreed. And immediately regretted it. My parents demanded to meet Daniil. I didn't want to. But he himself offered to go alone. He said he wanted to understand what he was dealing with. I warned him not to be alone with Jaeger. He smiled and said he would be careful. He returned from that meeting different. Inspired. Too calm. He said they made it all up themselves. It turned out my parents had offered to pay for the wedding. Almost entirely. But with one condition. Jaeger had to be the central figure. He was supposed to walk down the aisle in the same suit as the groom. He was supposed to have a separate cake. Separate photos. Because it's not right for the younger one to get married first. Because he needs to experience this too. They said it seriously. As if it were a normal proposal. As if they were doing us a favor. Daniil didn't argue. He said he'd think about it. And he left, leaving them confident he'd found leverage. He told me everything that same evening. At first I laughed. Then I started shaking. Then anger set in. And then clarity. If they want to play, we'll play. When Daniil and I made the decision, there was no triumph inside me. No gloating. It felt like I'd finally stopped running. As if for the first time in my life, I stood still and looked them in the face, not lowering my eyes. We didn't want a scandal. We didn't want revenge. We simply let them go, as far as they wanted. Daniil returned to his parents and played his part perfectly. He was polite. A little confused. He said I probably wouldn't agree, but he didn't see anything wrong with it. He added that I hate conflict and would never make a scene in front of guests. especially if I felt obligated to help them financially. It worked. I could almost physically feel how they relaxed, how they decided everything was under control. Most importantly, he convinced them there should be no messages.
No texts. No emails.
Everything should be verbal. Because I'm paranoid after my last relationship. Because I check my phone. They didn't even doubt it. It was convenient for them to believe this version. That's how their trap began. And they sprang it themselves. The wedding preparations turned into a strange spectacle. Formally, the parents were in charge of everything. In reality, it was Daniil. He masterfully tossed out ideas we supposedly couldn't afford. An expensive hall. An upgraded menu. The best photographer. He always did this in front of Jaeger. He immediately got fired up. He started saying that you can't skimp on an event like this. My parents nodded. The money was instantly there. Every time. I watched from the sidelines. Sometimes I felt disgusted. Sometimes I felt scared. Sometimes I wanted to stop everything. But Daniil reminded me every time, you're not doing anything wrong. They make their own decisions. You're just not a victim anymore. The only thing I couldn't resist was the dress. My mother tried to force me into an ugly style that emphasized everything I'd always hated about myself. She texted me about it. She broke her own rule. I refused. This time, firmly. Igor suggested accidentally ruining my dress. Daniil pretended to support the idea. It made me sick, but we were already too far away. I remember the wedding day in fragments. The lights. The music. The noise. I knew my parents' plan was simple. Igor was supposed to appear at the same moment the bride usually does. To go first, in a suit identical to Daniil's. To present me with a fait accompli.
To force me to swallow.
As always. But we had our own plan. We hired security. Discreetly. Until the last moment, no one knew what they were for. When the guests were already seated, a tall man in a formal suit stood at the entrance. His task was simple, not to let Jaeger in under any circumstances. When the music started playing, Dad stood to lead me down the aisle. I saw his face. He was tense. He wasn't expecting me. When the doors opened and I walked in, his face turned white. He looked back. The room was empty. At that moment, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and simply walked away. Left me, right there. A whisper swept through the hall. Someone gasped. I stood alone. And for the first time in my life, I felt no shame. I felt clarity. Daniil's father approached me and loudly declared that it would be an honor to escort me. I took his arm. And off I went. With my head held high. The tears were real. But they weren't from weakness. As the ceremony progressed, some of the guests disappeared. Then they returned wide-eyed. The truth emerged. Jaeger had arrived. In full groom's attire. They wouldn't let him in. He threw a tantrum right at the entrance. My father screamed. My mother sobbed. The guests heard everything. When they tried to accuse Daniil, he calmly asked if there was any evidence. There was none. Not a single message. Not a single recording. Only words. And no one believed words that day. Igor sat on the ground and screamed that this was supposed to be his day too. That he'd been promised. That he'd been deceived. It was filmed on phones. People watched. And they understood more than I could explain in years. They were escorted out. At the reception, no one ruined our celebration. People hugged me. They told me they were proud. That I was strong. I wasn't used to such words. But I soaked them up like a sponge. After the wedding, the barrage of messages began. I didn't respond. On Daniil's advice, Igor wrote that Daniil was leading him, that there was something between them, that I was blind. My parents threatened. They accused. Daniil collected everything. Screenshots. Calls. Messages. And I posted it in the family chat. Calmly. Politely. I asked them to stop bullying. After that, everything became quiet. I don't have a perfect family now. But I have a life. And that's my victory.